Hey guys, tonight we begin with a curious stroll through the dark alleyways of medieval myth. So before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. If your only exposure to Vikings involves towering blonde men smashing things with axes while screaming like they stubbed their toe on Valhalla itself, congratulations. You've already met the Berserkers. These guys were the original rage quitters of the medieval world. Warriors who, according to Norse sagas, went into a trance-like fury during battle, immune to pain, fear, and the concept of subtlety. For centuries, historians assumed berserkers were just poetic embellishment. After all, ancient texts tend to exaggerate. Dragons, sure, magic. Swords, obviously, men turning into werebears mid-fight. Probably metaphorical, right? Well, not quite. Recent scholarship and archaeological digs have started connecting some wild dots. First, let's talk fashion. Several Viking graves reveal animal pelts, notably bear and wolf, buried alongside warriors. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe they liked cosplay before it was cool. But then things got weirder. Enter the mushrooms. Specifically Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted fungi you've seen in fairy tales and Mario Kart. This mushroom isn't just a Pinterest aesthetic. It's psychoactive. And yes, it grows in parts of Scandinavia. Consuming it doesn't just make you see colors. It can induce euphoria, disassociation, sweating, shaking, and the sudden urge to fight your neighbor's goat. Combine that with rhythmic chanting, fasting, and pre-battle rituals, and you've basically got a chemically enhanced human tornado wielding a battle axe. Imagine showing up to raid a monastery and being greeted by a shirtless man foaming at the mouth. Contemporary accounts from enemies of the Vikings describe madmen, immune to wounds and utterly fearless. Some scholars even suggest they bit into shields, not for defense, but to control their convulsions. You know, normal Saturday night things. The term berserk now lives on in our vocabulary, but back then it was a terrifying tactical advantage. Imagine trying to form a disciplined shield wall while a hallucinogenic Norseman in a bear pelt sprints at you like he's in a heavy metal music video. Strategy meet chaos. Ah, yes. 1518. The year when hundreds of people in Strasbourg, France decided to fight despair, famine, and disease. The only way they knew how, by dancing. Not metaphorically, not romantically. Literally dancing until their feet bled, their hearts gave out, and the local authorities considered whether banning music might be healthier than banning witches. At first, it started small. One woman, Fraffa, stepped into the street and began dancing. No music, no audience, just pure medieval groove. A couple hours in and you'd expect someone to throw her a loaf of bread and suggest a nap. Instead, people watched. Then they joined. Because apparently in 1518, seeing someone dance themselves into delirium meant, hey, looks fun. I'm in. Within days, dozens were dancing then. Hundreds, and not at a festival in the middle of the street in the sweltering summer heat without food, water, or any sense of self-preservation. It would have made a great TikTok trend minus the mass casualties. What's baffling is the response from city leaders. Instead of, say, quarantining the dancers or bringing in doctors, they leaned into it. Literally, they hired musicians, built a stage, encouraged the dancers to get it out of their system. That's right. Their cure for compulsive death dancing was to crank up the medieval bass. As you can imagine, that didn't work. Historians were long divided on whether this was real or just another pious parable from a time when leeches were considered medicine and astrology made career choices. But numerous records, city accounts, church logs, personal letters, all confirm the same terrifying. Footnote. People danced involuntarily, and some didn't survive. So, what caused it? The top theories are 1. Ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on rye and can cause convulsions, visions, and extremely poor life choices. Or 2. Mass psychogenic illness. Basically, collective madness sparked by stress, fear, and a lack of hobbies. Whatever it was, it turned one city into a grim disco for a month straight. And if there's a moral here, it's this. Medieval Europe didn't always burn witches. Sometimes it threw them a dance party. If there's one thing the medieval period excelled at, it was turning optimism into tragedy with breathtaking efficiency. Case in point, the Children's Crusade of 1212. A campaign that sounds like a Disney sequel, but plays out more like a dark. Found guilty of killing a child and was sentenced to death. She was dressed in human clothing, paraded through town, and publicly hanged because symbolism, retribution. General medieval weirdness, even insects weren't safe. In 1510, a group of French peasants sued a horde of weevils for destroying their crops. The court appointed a lawyer to represent the insects, presumably someone who had annoyed the judge recently. After several hearings, the case was dismissed because, well, the bugs didn't show up. Classic defendant behavior. But here's the twist. This wasn't random insanity. To medieval minds, justice applied to the entire creation. Animals, though lower than humans, were still part of God's moral universe. If they committed a crime or were suspected of being in league with dark forces, they faced the consequences. The Middle Ages didn't do things halfway. Some of these trials were ecclesiastical, meaning the church got involved. Others were secular with full legal proceedings. All of them are now prime examples of how deeply humans can anthropomorphize anything with legs and a bad attitude. Nothing says medieval torture quite like the Iron Maiden. That infamous human-shaped metal sarcophagus lined with spikes on the inside designed to turn heretics into Swiss cheese. You've seen it in museums, horror films, and probably that one guy's edgy high school sketchbook. There's just one problem. It's a complete historical fraud. Yes, the Iron Maiden is one of the most iconic torture devices never actually used in the Middle Ages, and yet it's paraded around as if it were the go-to tool of every moody inquisitor with a flair for the theatrical. Truth is, medieval torturers were creative, disturbingly so. But this particular device was a 19th century invention because apparently the Industrial Revolution wasn't horrifying enough on its own. So where did it come from? The first known Iron Maiden was cobbled together in the late 1700s or early 1800s in Germany, likely by someone who thought, you know what? This museum needs a big spiky lie. The idea was to create a compelling and horrifying display of what medieval justice might have looked like if everyone back then had watched too many slasher films. It was a hit. People loved the spectacle. Because nothing sells quite like a morbid mix of pseudo-history and bloodthirsty imagination. Even museums leaned into it. You can still find Iron Maidens proudly displayed behind glass, with placards that quietly mention, actually, this is a Victorian-era replica of something we made up entirely. Of course, medieval people did use torture extensively, creatively, and with almost no HR department oversight. There were racks, thumb screws, heretics' forks, and something called the pear of anguish, which sounds like a fruit, but isn't. But the Iron Maiden, not on the list. They were too busy being horrible in more practical ways. Why did the myth stick? Because it feels true. It fits the narrative of a brutal, superstitious age. It's also visually terrifying, a perfect icon for our collective nightmares about the past. And so, a fake torture box became a real symbol of medieval cruelty. Let's clear up one of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages. No, medieval Europeans did not think the earth was flat. They weren't that kind of clueless. They had other issues. Plague, famine, surprise invasions by relatives with swords. But basic planetary geometry wasn't one of them. In fact, most educated people in the Middle Ages knew the earth was a sphere. Monks, scholars, and sailors understood it. Heck, even school books from the 1200s explained the earth's roundness. Usually while subtly threatening children with eternal damnation if they didn't memorize Latin conjugations. The myth of a flat earth-believing Middle Ages was actually cooked up much later in the 19th century when historians wanted to make the Renaissance and Enlightenment look cooler by comparison. It's easier to feel superior when you imagine your ancestors navigating with maps that resembled pizza boxes. The real medieval cosmology came from thinkers like Isidore of Seville, Bede the Venerable, and Thomas Aquinas. People with very pointy handwriting and extremely strong opinions on theology, philosophy, and celestial spheres. They weren't always right, mind you, but they definitely weren't flat earthers. Many based their understanding on Aristotle and Ptolemy, who again were all aboard the spherical earth train. There were even practical reasons for knowing the earth was round. Ships disappearing over the horizon. Round earth. The curved shadow on the moon during a lunar eclipse. Round earth. The fact that people in Spain couldn't see the same stars as people in Egypt. Again round earth. Medieval logic may have been 30% divine revelation, 20% Latin mumbling, and 50% random guesswork, but they still got this one right. The confusion mainly comes from a few scattered quotes taken wildly out of context and a whole lot of 19th century revisionism. Washington Irving, yes, the Sleepy Hollow guy, wrote a wildly popular fictionalized biography of Columbus that exaggerated how radical his round earth voyage seemed. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Imagine being accused of theft in a medieval village. No fingerprints, no camera footage, no you won't believe what they did. Town crier drama. Just you, a priest, a crowd of nosy neighbors, and a cauldron of boiling water. Because in the Middle Ages, justice often meant trial by ordeal, a legal process that relied less on evidence and more on divine intervention and 30 burns. There were several popular orals, all of them designed to make you question your life choices. The ordeal of hot iron required the accused to carry a red-hot bar of iron for a few paces. If your hand healed cleanly in a few days, God clearly liked you. If it didn't, well, sorry, sinner. The ordeal of boiling water was even more fun. You'd plunge your hand into a pot of boiling water to retrieve a stone. Again, healing nicely, innocent, healing. Like a pizza left under a heat lamp. Guilty. And then there was the ordeal of cold water, which sounds more pleasant, but wasn't. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty because water being pure would reject them. If they sank, well, innocent, but also dead. The system had its flaws. Now, modern minds might assume this was just barbaric nonsense. And yes, a strong argument can be made. But oddly, trial by ordeal sometimes worked. Not because of miracles, but because of psychology. Many people who knew they were guilty refused to go through with it, confessed beforehand, or settled matters another way. And the priests, oh, they often quietly rigged the results. Let the cauldron cool a bit. Use mild water. Judge the healing with some flexibility. They weren't sadists most of the time. Just bureaucrats with robes. Eventually, trial by ordeal was banned by the church in 1215. Apparently, someone finally realized that burning people to prove their innocence might not be the pinnacle of divine wisdom. From then on, Europe slowly pivoted toward more rational legal systems. You know, like jewels, witch hunting, and accusing your neighbor of consorting with frogs. Ah, Robin Hood, the green-clad outlaw with the sharp arrows, sharper cheekbones, and an unshakable moral compass. Stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, and somehow keeping his tunic wrinkle-free while living in a forest. Sounds great, doesn't it? Almost too great. That's because the Robin Hood we know, the dashing rebel hero who spouts one-liners while dodging arrows in slow motion, is about 90% literary invention and 10% actual medieval tax drama. But here's the fun part. Someone like Robin Hood probably did exist, or rather several someones. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries mention men with suspiciously hoodish names, Robe Hod, Hobahod, and variations like Robberes Hoodoos, often listed as criminals or fugitives. And by criminals, we mean people who may have just skipped out on taxes, poached a deer, or looked at the local sheriff funny. None of them robbed banks or hosted socialist banquets under oak trees. But they were outlaws in the literal sense, cast outside the law, surviving on wit, bows, and a deep mistrust of authority. Over time, their stories merged into a composite legend like a medieval version of fanfiction. If that fanfiction also involved lots of stabbing and plague, the earliest ballads about Robin Hood aren't exactly Disney-friendly either. In the 14th century versions, Robin is violent, short-tempered, and disturbingly fond of murdering monks. Maid Marian doesn't even make an appearance until later. And Friar Tuck, he'd sooner throw you in a pond than listen to your sins. Still, the legend evolved. By the time of the Tutor, Robin Hood had morphed into a cheerful rogue with a heart of gold and suspiciously modern values about wealth redistribution. Because nothing says medieval England like 16th century political spin. Was there a real Robin Hood? Probably not one single person. But the conditions that birthed the myth, corrupt officials, hungry peasants, and forests just begging for cinematic lighting were very real. When you hear Black Knight, you probably picture some brooding guy in dented armor, sulking in the shadows, monologuing about vengeance while lightning cracks behind him. Basically a medieval Batman with worse dental hygiene. But in actual medieval history, the Black Knight wasn't a cackling villain or an edgy character from a Monty Python sketch. It was a real title, or at least a nickname with some surprisingly respectable roots. Black Knight usually referred to knights who either wore black armor, had a black coat of arms, or were associated with a noble family's dark cold livery. That's it. No necromancy, no soul harvesting, no dramatic declarations like, "You shall not pass." In fact, many Black Knights were just regular nobles trying to coordinate their outfits. One of the most famous was Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince. He was a 14th century English prince and military commander. Beloved by some, feared by others, and not at all the kind of guy who'd sit around in a cursed tower. He likely earned the nickname posthumously, maybe due to his black armor, or maybe because of his enthusiasm for burning French towns. Historians are still debating, mostly in polite academic jewels. It wasn't until centuries later that the term Black Knight started accumulating villain points. Romantic literature, 19th century novels, and early Hollywood gave the term a glow up, or more accurately, a gloom down. Suddenly, the Black Knight became the brooding loner, lurking on the fringes of tournaments, morally ambiguous, and often shirtless for some reason. But back in the real Middle Ages, Black Knights were just part of the color-coded feudal fashion scene. They didn't swear dark oaths under blood moons. They just wanted their armor to match their family banners, and maybe look cool while doing it. Some medieval stories sound like they were written after a few too many pints of me. Take for example the tale of a shining city, built in the middle of a swamp by monks, a sort of holy Venice, but with more prayer and less gondolas. For centuries, local folklore in the English Fenlands spoke of Crowland Abbey, a marvel of stone and piety, standing proudly on an island of dry land surrounded by boggy despair. It was said that monks built bridges out of faith, logs, and possibly divine stubbornness. Scholars long dismissed it as a quaint exaggeration. After all, who in their right medieval mind would build a monastery in a swamp? Well, monks would. Recent excavations have confirmed that Crowland Abbey, founded in the 8th century and expanded throughout the Middle Ages, did indeed rise out of the muck, complete with causeways, raised walkways, and early drainage systems so clever they make modern plumbing blush. These monks weren't just praying in the mist, they were engineering their way through it. They constructed wooden platforms on piles driven deep into the peat. They used gravel and clay to firm up walkways. And they built bridges, including the famous triangular bridge, which still survives today. Three-way symmetry, baby. You don't get that kind of architectural ambition from drunken peasants with a shovel. So why the swamp? Well, 2 reasons. Isolation and tax breaks. Monasteries were supposed to be separate from the sinful world. Nothing says holy isolation like being surrounded by mosquitoes the size of pigeons. Plus, land no one else wanted was often cheaper. So, monks got crafty. They turned the marshes into a hub of spiritual and economic activity. Farming eels, making cheese, and somehow not getting trench foot every winter. The result, a real life miracle of persistence, engineering, and mild dampness. One that confirms that even the strangest sounding medieval legends might be hiding a soggy little nugget of truth. Ah, yes. Pope Joan, the mysterious woman who supposedly fooled the entire Catholic Church, rose through the ecclesiastical ranks, became pope, and then dramatically gave birth in the middle of a papal procession. You know, your standard medieval Tuesday. For centuries, her story was whispered with scandalous glee and then furiously denied by church scribes with the energy of someone deleting browser history. Many modern historians declared it medieval gossip, a cautionary tale, cooked up by monks who really didn't want women near the altar. But here's the thing. Recent reevaluations of medieval texts, art, and papal timelines have made some historians raise an eyebrow, and not in the sarcastic way. The earliest detailed versions of Joan's story appear in 13th century chronicles, but there are earlier hints. For example, the 11th century chronicle of Mariana Scotus lists an unnamed pope between Leo IV and Benedict III, a suspicious gap where Pope Joan supposedly reigned. Coincidence or just a medieval clerical error? Pun unavoidable. Then there's the odd tradition of the Citia Stercaria, a throne with a suspiciously hollowed-out seat used during papal enthronements. Some believe it was designed to check that the new pope had the appropriate holy plumbing. Historians dismiss this as symbolic tradition, but really if your throne has a built-in gender inspection feature, maybe you're protesting too much. Art complicates things further. Some medieval tarot decks and church murals feature a female pope figure. Was it Joan or just the Middle Ages being weird again with symbolism? Hard to say. Medieval art wasn't exactly subtle. It's the same genre that put dragons next to saints and occasionally drew horses with human feet. So what do we make of Joan? A real figure erased from history? A medieval urban legend, a proto-feminist fever dream? The answer may lie somewhere in between. While there's no definitive proof she existed, there's also no smoking papal decree that debunks her. Just a lot of very anxious-looking church historians from the 14th century onward who seemed desperate to change the subject. And if she did exist, she pulled off the greatest medieval disguise ever and had the worst gender reveal party in history. The myth goes like this. The reason Friday the 13th is considered unlucky has nothing to do with spilled salt or broken mirrors. It all goes back to the dramatic downfall of the Knights Templar. And unlike most scary campfire tales, this one actually has a historical backbone and a sword and a very angry French king. Let's rewind to October 13th, 1307. A. Friday, naturally, when King Philip IV of France decided he was done being broke and slightly jealous of a secretive military religious order that had more land, more money, and frankly, better capes than he did. With the subtlety of a toddler flipping a board game, Philip ordered the mass arrest of the Knights Templar. Across France, hundreds were seized, tortured, and accused of crimes that ranged from spitting on the cross to worshipping a mysterious bearded head, which, if you've ever seen medieval relics, is honestly not that weird. The Pope at the time, Clement V, tried to act surprised, but eventually folded under pressure. And by pressure, we mean Philip breathing heavily down his neck with an army. The Church disbanded the order in 1312, and the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314. Before his fiery exit, he allegedly cursed both the king and the Pope. And guess what? They both died within a year. Coincidence or medieval karma? So yes, the connection between Friday the 13th and the Templars has historical roots, though the superstition didn't really bloom until centuries later. But the drama, that's 100% certified. Medieval. The Templars weren't just knights. They were bankers, crusaders, landowners, and walking PR nightmares for secular rulers. Their downfall wasn't caused by heresy. It was caused by debt. King Philip owed them a lot of money, and nothing clears a tab like a few strategic executions and a smear campaign. When you think of medieval surgery, chances are you picture a bearded man with questionable hygiene, sawing off limbs with a kitchen knife while screaming, "God wills it!" over a background chorus of patient agony and Gregorian chants. And honestly, that happened more than once. But here's the twist. Not all medieval medicine was utter madness. Some of it actually worked. No. Seriously. Recent analysis of 10th to 14th century medical manuals and archaeological remains shows that medieval surgeons weren't complete sadists with a hacksaw and a prayer. In fact, they were surprisingly competent at wound care, trepanation, and even cataract surgery, with tools that look like they were designed by a blacksmith on a budget. Take trepanation, the act of drilling a hole in your skull to relieve pressure, cure headaches, or release those pesky demons. Because why trust Tylenol when you can ventilate your brain? Archaeological evidence shows patients survive these procedures at decent rates, their skulls showing signs of healing. So not just a medieval lobotomy, more like a last-ditch effort with a decent follow-through. And then there's wound care. Texts like the Trot and Curia Magna contain recipes that would make a modern herbalist weep with joy. Honey, an antiseptic. Wine, a disinfectant, and linen bandages were all used. Not quite penicillin, but honestly better than the rub, mud, and hope approach often credited to the era. Even dental work wasn't all pliers and screaming. Some surgeons used gold wire to secure loose teeth. Granted, medieval toothpaste was mostly charcoal and regret, but hey, they tried. Yes, there were leeches and urine analysis. And yes, if you had a suspicious mole, someone might call it a sign of witchcraft and light you on fire. But overall, if you avoided the plague, war, injuries, and humor imbalances, you had a fighting chance with a halfway decent barber surgeon. Of course, this doesn't mean medieval hospitals were soothing wellness spas. They were more like chaotic monasteries with a prayer budget, a bone saw, and a lot of yelling. But the myth that all medieval medicine was blind guesswork isn't entirely fair. Sometimes medieval doctors knew what they were doing. Other times they were just winging it with holy water and optimism. But credit where it's due, some of those patients actually walked out with all their limbs still attached. Let's bust one of the most stubborn medieval myths. The idea that everyone from the 5th to the 15th century wandered around like stinky, unwashed potatoes wrapped in wool. Contrary to this very pungent stereotype, many medieval people were not only aware of personal hygiene, they were downright fussy about it. Archaeological digs and Manuscript evidence suggests that bathing, grooming, and scented oils were not only common, but part of a decent person's weekly routine. Now, did they shower twice a day and exfoliate with apricot scrubs? Absolutely not. But they did use soaps made from animal fat and ashes and earthy tones. And many households had wooden tubs they filled with hot water for a nice soak, assuming you had a servant to haul it in and you didn't live in a drafty shack. And don't even get started on the public bathhouse, especially in places like medieval Paris, London, and the Islamic caliphates where shared steamy bathing was both a social activity and a way to not smell like old cheese. Some even had separate rooms for men and women. And yes, it sometimes got a little too social, which is why a few church leaders started side-eyeing the whole bathhouse industry. But hygiene wasn't just about water and soap. People trimmed their nails, cleaned their ears, and plucked their armpit hair with terrifying enthusiasm. Monks had strict grooming rituals. Nobles had perfumed gloves and tooth powders made from burnt rosemary and crushed shells, which probably didn't whiten your teeth, but at least it smelled like you tried. So, how did the everyone was dirty and smelled like fermented onions myth begin? It likely stems from post-medieval bias, especially from the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, where writers loved dunking on the Dark Ages to make themselves feel more, well, enlightened. Add in a few 19th century illustrators who never met a dirty peasant trope they didn't love, and voila, stinky medieval meme unlocked. To be fair, if you were a serf working 14 hours in a dung fill, you probably didn't end the day smelling like lavender and ambition. But the blanket assumption that no one in the Middle Ages knew how to wash their armpits officially debunked. So, yes, medieval people bathed. Not daily, not always alone, but bathed. Nonetheless. No, this isn't a deleted Monty Python sketch. In certain parts of medieval Europe, people accused of crimes were subjected to something called the trial by consecrated bread or ordeal of the morsel. For those of you with a flair for ominous baked goods, here's how it worked. An accused person, usually a clergyman, would be brought in front of a jury of solemn, probably half-asleep monks. They'd then be handed a small piece of holy bread. Yes, blessed God-approved bread, and asked to chew and swallow it. Sounds simple, right? Like communion with steaks. The twist: if the accused choked, gagged, or looked generally nervous while eating the bread, boom. Guilty. Not just you seem suspicious. Guilty. We're talking God himself is now involved and he clearly thinks you're shady. Guilty. This method was based on the belief that divine power would physically stop a liar from swallowing the body of Christ. Apparently, celestial justice had a direct line to your esophagus. It was essentially a medieval lie detector test, but instead of wires and sweat glands, you got carbs and judgmental monks. And you thought job interviews were stressful. What's wild is that this wasn't fringe behavior. These orals were sanctioned by church authorities for centuries, especially in Anglo-Saxon England. It was believed that divine intervention would reveal the truth where mortal justice failed. And because nothing says fair trial like giving a dry cracker to a terrified man and hoping he doesn't have acid reflux. Eventually, even the church realized this was getting a little silly. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III, who sounds like he should have been innocent, but really wasn't, banned clergy from participating in orals altogether. That basically shut the whole operation down. No monks, no magic bread. But the fact that this happened at all, totally real. It wasn't metaphor. It wasn't satire. It was bureaucracy baked. The initiation of a new Templar did not begin with fanfare or public ceremony. It began in silence in the earliest hours of the morning when the world still lingered in darkness. A candidate, usually a young knight of noble birth, would approach the gates of a Templar precept, a fortress monastery that was part barracks, part holy sanctuary. He arrived with no fanfare, no escort, and no weapons. By custom, he was to come humbly, leaving behind the trappings of his old life. His sword, his shield, his armor, and even his family's name would mean little inside those walls. To join the order was to sever ties with earthly glory. The gatekeeper admitted him into a courtyard still shadowed by torchlight. The air was thick with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Here silence was enforced. He was forbidden to speak until spoken to. Brothers of the temple guided him into the chapel, the heart of the ritual. Unlike the grand cathedrals of Christendom, a Templar chapel was often stark and bare. Flickering lamps threw long shadows across stone walls, while relics, splinters of the true cross, bones of saints, and holy icons were arranged upon the altar. The setting was designed to impress upon the initiate that he was stepping into a realm where the sacred outweighed the worldly. The brothers assembled in solemn ranks, their white mantles marked with the blood-red cross. The candidate stood alone before them, a solitary figure beneath their watchful gaze. Every movement was deliberate, every moment choreographed to remind him that he was no longer an individual, but a servant of a larger divine cause. Even the air seemed heavy, filled with an unspoken question. Was he truly ready to abandon everything? The dawn light began to creep through narrow slits in the chapel walls, illuminating the altar as the candidate was led forward. His journey had begun not with battle, but with surrender. Before him lay not an enemy, but an order that demanded absolute devotion. He was not there to prove his strength with the sword, but to demonstrate humility before God and obedience to the Master. This was the threshold, the last breath of his old life and the first step into the secretive brotherhood of the Knights Templar. The candidate's first true trial was not of sword or shield, but of his own heart. After being brought into the chapel, he stood before the master of the temple, who presided over the ritual like both judge and father. Around them, the brothers formed a living wall of silence, their eyes fixed on the man about to renounce his past life. The questioning began with ritual formality. The master would ask the candidate whether he came of his own free will without coercion or deceit. This was not mere rhetoric. The Templars demanded certainty. A man who joined unwillingly could not be trusted, and a man who sought the order for selfish gain was worse than useless. He was asked, "Do you desire to enter the company of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and to serve God all the days of your life?" The questions grew sharper, designed to pierce through pride and uncover hidden motives. Did he owe debts? Was he married or bound by promises to women or lords? Did he carry obligations that would conflict with his new vows? Any hesitation in answering could spell rejection. The Templars sought men unencumbered by divided loyalties, for a divided man could not fight with a pure heart. Then came the questions that tested courage. The master warned him that the life ahead would not be easy. You will know no ease, no wealth, no luxury. You will be called to hunger, to hardship, and to death in the service of Christ. The candidate was reminded that he would wear a simple robe, eat plain food, and surrender any personal possessions. He would obey commands without hesitation, even unto death. This was not romantic knighthood. It was discipline bordering on monastic severity. If the candidate faltered, this was the moment to turn back. Many did. The ritual allowed a man to walk away before making the oath, sparing both him and the order from later regret. But if he stood firm, the master pressed him once more. "Do you still wish to remain?" A resolute answer marked the difference between a mere visitor and a brother in arms. This questioning was not meant to humiliate, but to refine. It stripped away illusions and forced the man to confront the weight of his choice. Only when his answers satisfied the master and the assembled brothers did the ritual move forward. He was now on the very edge of binding himself, not just to an army, but to a holy cause that claimed his soul as much as his sword. Once the candidate had proven his resolve through questioning, the ritual moved into its most sacred phase, the taking of vows. Unlike secular knighthood, which emphasized honor, wealth, and lineage, the Knights Templar demanded the opposite. The initiate was asked to renounce not only earthly pleasures but also his very sense of independence. The first vow was poverty. Standing before relics of the saints and the cross, he declared that he would own nothing personally. Any wealth, land, or inheritance he possessed would be surrendered to the order. From that moment forward, his bed, his cloak, his sword, even the bread he ate, all belonged not to him, but to Christ through the temple. Poverty was not symbolic. It was total. A Templar knight might have once commanded dozens of servants, but now he would sleep on straw and share meager rations with his brothers. The second vow was chastity. Here the candidate swore to renounce women, marriage, and the comforts of family life. For many knights, this was the hardest oath. To forsake heirs meant to cut off dynastic legacy, a duty that noble families prized above all. Yet Templars demanded it without hesitation. The initiates swore to love no woman in a carnal sense, devoting all passion instead to Christ and the Virgin Mary. This was one of the reasons the order's rituals later fueled suspicion. In a society where marriage defined one's role, men who cut themselves off from women were seen as unnatural, perhaps even dangerous. The third vow was obedience. If poverty demanded surrender of possessions, and chastity demanded surrender of desire, obedience demanded surrender of will. The candidates swore to follow the commands of the master and his superiors instantly and without question, whether on the battlefield or in the cloister. This vow bound the knight as tightly as chains. His life was no longer his own. If commanded to ride into certain death, he would go. If commanded to wait in silence for years, guarding a remote outpost, he would endure. Taken together, these vows stripped a man of the three things most prized in medieval knighthood: wealth, family, and independence. But in their place, the order offered something greater, belonging to a brotherhood that claimed to serve not an earthly lord but God himself. It was in this surrender that the candidate ceased to be a mere warrior and became a Templar. With the vows spoken, the ritual deepened into a physical act of devotion, the kissing of holy relics. This was no mere gesture of piety. It was the binding seal of the candidate's oaths before him. The altar had been prepared with the most sacred treasures the order possessed: a fragment of the true cross, bones of saints, or a gospel manuscript. These relics were believed to hold divine power, and to touch or kiss them was to invite God himself to witness the promise. The candidate, now kneeling, was guided forward by two senior brothers. He lowered his head in submission, not to the master or the brethren, but to the sacred objects that represented heaven's authority. The first kiss was often upon the cross, a symbolic union with Christ's suffering. This was meant to remind him that the knight's life would be one of sacrifice, hardship, and service, mirroring the sacrifice on Calvary. Next came the relics of saints, men and women who had lived holy lives of endurance and faith. By pressing his lips to their remains, the initiate aligned himself with their legacy. It was a moment of transference where the living pledged to carry the torch of the dead. To refuse the kiss would have been unthinkable, but the act was more than symbolic. In the medieval imagination, to kiss a relic was to form a covenant. Breaking that covenant would endanger one's soul for eternity. The ritual was heavy with silence. The gathered brothers stood still, their white mantles unmoving, while the soft sound of lips against relics echoed in the chapel. The candidate knew that every kiss was not just a kiss of faith, but a kiss of binding. From that moment forward, betrayal would not only shame him before men, but condemn him before God. This act of veneration also added fuel to later myths. Outsiders whispered that the Templars kissed relics and secret rites, or worse, that they kissed forbidden objects of blasphemy. Such rumors spread in later centuries would haunt the order. But in truth, this moment was deeply orthodox. A sacred sealing of vows that mirrored practices found across medieval Christendom. When the final relic was kissed, the initiate was no longer simply a candidate. He was bound by lips and oaths tied to a chain of faith that stretched back to saints, apostles, and Christ himself. The vows and relics had bound the candidate spiritually, but the order demanded a visible display of humility before he could be welcomed fully. This moment came when he knelt before the master of the temple, a gesture that transformed him from knight of the world to servant of Christ's militia. In medieval society, kneeling was a symbol of fealty, a way of showing submission to a lord. But in the Templar rite, the meaning was even deeper. The candidate knelt not to a man, but to the discipline and divine mission embodied by the master. The ritual was simple, but heavy with meaning. The candidate sank onto both knees, head bowed, his hands pressed together as if in prayer. This posture was no accident. It echoed the way a vassal pledged loyalty to a feudal lord, yet stripped of the worldly rewards that came with such service. Here there would be no lands, no castles, no riches promised in return. Instead, the knight was binding himself to poverty, chastity, obedience, and the perpetual hardships of holy war. The master placed his hands over the candidates, sealing the act with authority. Then came the words of command, a reminder that from this moment forward, the initiate must obey without hesitation. Whether the order was to ride into battle, to guard a lonely fortress in the desert, or to spend years in prayer and fasting, his duty was absolute. Obedience was not a matter of negotiation. It was total. Yet there was also comfort in this kneeling. For all its severity, the order was a brotherhood. The candidate was no longer an isolated warrior, but a part of a chain of loyalty and protection. By kneeling, he signaled his willingness to be shaped, disciplined, and defended by his brothers as much as he was now bound to serve them. Observers outside the chapel might have seen only a knight kneeling before another man, but within the order, this act carried a mystical dimension. To kneel was to die to the self, to cast aside pride, and to be reborn in service to God's will. It was the act that broke the knight's worldly identity and remade him into a Templar. When the master raised him up, he was no longer a supplicant. He was a brother, marked by humility, yet bound to carry himself with the unshakable strength of one who served not kings, but the kingdom of heaven. After kneeling before the master, the initiate was not yet complete. The ritual reached its communal stage, his acceptance among the brethren. If the vows had tied him to God, and the kneeling had bound him to obedience, this next step put him into the living fabric of the order itself. The gathered knights, standing in solemn ranks, now became witnesses and guarantors of his new life. They were not silent spectators. Their presence mattered. In the dim light of the chapel, their white mantles with the crimson cross created a striking image, reminding the candidate of the purity demanded, and the blood he might one day spill. Each brother had endured the same questioning, sworn the same vows, and bent the same knee. To be admitted into their company was not simply to join an army. It was to become part of a spiritual family. At this point, the master would turn to the assembly and ask if any brother had reason to oppose the new initiate. It was a dramatic moment filled with tension. If someone knew of a hidden sin, an unresolved oath, or a dishonorable act from the candidate's past, he was bound to speak. Silence was agreement. It meant that the man was accepted as pure enough for the temple. The weight of collective approval was immense. Acceptance was not only by the master but by the entire brotherhood. Once no objection was raised, the master declared the candidate a Templar. At this Pronouncement, the atmosphere shifted. The brothers, who had until then remained rigid and distant, now welcomed him with a gesture of fraternity. Some rituals mentioned the kiss of peace, where each knight greeted the new brother with a kiss on the cheek, a sign of spiritual kinship. Others describe a symbolic embrace, bringing the initiate physically into the fold. This moment of acceptance carried enormous significance. The knight was no longer alone, no longer a wandering warrior with only his sword for company. He had gained hundreds of brothers who would fight, pray, eat, and even die beside him. Yet, the secrecy surrounding these rites, especially the kiss of peace, fueled later rumors that the Templars harbored strange, even heretical practices. Outsiders excluded from the chapel. Imagine sinister oaths and blasphemous acts, but for the brothers themselves, it was simply the essay. Protection. By kneeling, he signaled his willingness to be shaped, disciplined, and defended by his brothers as much as he was now bound to serve them. Observers outside the chapel might have seen only a knight kneeling before another man, but within the order, this act carried a mystical dimension. To kneel was to die to the self, to cast aside pride, and to be reborn in service to God's will. It was the act that broke the knight's worldly identity and remade him into a Templar. When the master raised him up, he was no longer a supplicant. He was a brother, marked by humility, yet bound to carry himself with the unshakable strength of one who served not kings, but the kingdom of heaven. After kneeling before the master, the initiate was not yet complete. The ritual reached its communal stage, his acceptance among the brethren. If the vows had tied him to God, and the kneeling had bound him to obedience, this next step were him into the living fabric of the order itself. The gathered knights, standing in solemn ranks, now became witnesses and guarantors of his new life. They were not silent spectators. Their presence mattered. In the dim light of the chapel, their white mantles with the crimson cross created a striking image, reminding the candidate of the purity demanded, and the blood he might one day spill. Each brother had endured the same questioning, sworn the same vows, and bent the same knee. To be admitted into their company was not simply to join an army. It was to become part of a spiritual family. At this point, the master would turn to the assembly and ask if any brother had reason to oppose the new initiate. It was a dramatic moment filled with tension. If someone knew of a hidden sin, an unresolved oath, or a dishonorable act from the candidate's past, he was bound to speak. Silence was agreement. It meant that the man was accepted as pure enough for the temple. The weight of collective approval was immense. Acceptance was not only by the master but by the entire brotherhood. Once no objection was raised, the master declared the candidate a Templar. At this pronouncement, the atmosphere shifted. The brothers, who had until then remained rigid and distant, now welcomed him with a gesture of fraternity. Some rituals mentioned the kiss of peace, where each knight greeted the new brother with a kiss on the cheek, a sign of spiritual kinship. Others describe a symbolic embrace, bringing the initiate physically into the fold. This moment of acceptance carried enormous significance. The knight was no longer alone, no longer a wandering warrior with only his sword for company. He had gained hundreds of brothers who would fight, pray, eat, and even die beside him. Yet, the secrecy surrounding these rites, especially the kiss of peace, fueled later rumors that the Templars harbored strange, even heretical practices. Outsiders excluded from the chapel. Imagine sinister oaths and blasphemous acts, but for the brothers themselves, it was simply the essay.